And we are live. This is Dark Journalist, and it's great to have everyone here. What a great crowd already. Thank you very much for joining me. I know last night we did the JFK special on the files, and of course tonight we are doing the X series part 8, dealing with Pine Gap and esoteric circles, which is going to become really important because the people in those circles, like Rudolf Steiner and Jeane Dixon and some very interesting Masons, are going to complete the circle of us looking at Pine Gap, and it's quite an explosion by the end because we're getting really into the meat of the action here in part 8. And what's happening really is we've been hovering over these various threads that are going on in tracking the X Steganography. And of course, before I go any further, we have Olivia, who is handling everything that I'm not handling. How are you, Olivia?
I'm doing great.
Fantastic. And she's out there taking care of everyone. And as you well know, all of your questions we're going to deal with in the second part of the show. And so anything that you have, you can tell her anytime during the show. Just make sure it's in caps so she can read it. And we'll get into those in the second half because, you know, in many ways, it is a crowdsourcing situation here. And the information that is going back and forth is giving us all a bigger picture. So I love presenting the stuff that I'm researching on, but I also love to hear what you guys are interested in and what you're looking at in relation to the series. And I know some people have been doing some very interesting investigations into the X. And so coming in from all these different angles, we're getting this incredible tapestry of what it really means and what it's all about. And in short, you know, we were tracking some basic steganography that had to do with secret files that were being kept that involved things like UFO crashes in the 40s. And we saw that technology, whatever it was, move through the 50s and 60s in programs like Blue Gemini and through the work of paperclip scientists like Walter Dornberger. Well, it turned out the X had a sort of separate life of its own because as I was doing research for Robert Merritt's special about Robert Merritt was a whistleblower who came forward to tell us about his work for President Nixon. And he told us about Nixon having this special letter to the American people. And he told us about Planet X in relation to that and how Nixon was discussing this. So the X came up there. I did a little bit of digging and we found LBJ had a letter X that's still on tap at his library until 2023, not to be opened until 50 years after his death. And I went a little further back, and Eisenhower had a time capsule, and his time capsule was called Project X. And as we looked into these different things, and we saw that President Reagan, for example, was funding UFO documentaries as Nixon was trying to get UFO disclosure going in the early 70s, we started to see that all these presidents realized that something is going to come out about this. And I'm not going to call it specifically alien life or anything like that. What it is really is that we're following the X technology and by following the steganography. But if we turn that camera around a little bit, going the other way, we see it all through history with the mystery schools, especially when we get into that period dealing with the 19th century, just before this X is going to come out to the public and they're going to have to deal with it because they've been dealing with this mystery all along. So in essence, the X still carries through. You'll still see companies like Boeing and SpaceX and everything that has to do around space and technology. This X pops up over and over again. And, you know, of course, in the normal course of doing business, you can say an X will come up here in this series or that car series or whatever. That's not really what we're getting at. Because remember, steganography is not like cryptology. So in one case, you've got something where, you know, if you had a code like Morse code, or they had those incredible Enigma machines that the Germans made during World War II. And that's the something where you know it's a code and you spend all this time trying to crack it. Steganography works exactly the opposite. You are not supposed to be able to see it, so you never have a chance to try to crack it. It's just there in plain sight and it's hidden. It's only people who can know how to look for it that can see it. Now, you have to be able, after a while, when you thread these things together, you've figured out the puzzle that is placed there by these people who are communicating with each other. And I think very often, you know, there's this incredible movie called The Falcon and the Snowman that Olivia and I were watching last week. And one of the things that they do when they're doing this spy activity, and interestingly enough, the guy was getting all this intel from Pine Gap in the movie. And it's a Falcon and the Snowman is really quite exceptional. And who's the actor we liked in that? Our friend Spicoli there.
Yeah. He used to be married to Madonna.
Sean Penn. Yeah. Sean Penn. This is a very early role for him. And I guess no one knew that he could act. And he acts up a storm. Would you agree?
He's incredible.
It's really, he kind of steals the movie. And he's kind of a low-level drug figure while his friend is an NSA code breaker. And the combination of the two is just staggering. But in this movie, in order to set up these meetings that they're having with their spy counterparts selling this intel, they put all these X's on these telephone poles. So for you and me walking by, for example, that wouldn't mean anything to us. But for someone who understood the steganography of that X, they know that it means meet me at such and such a place Tuesday night. So that is the nature of the steganography, and that is how these things operate. Now, when you get into time differences, we really have to look deeply, because when you go back 100 years, I was making an observation that even in the late 60s, so much of the lingo and the language has changed that things mean something totally different. So, when we watch movies from the 60s, there's a kind of a translation factor. When you go back to the late 19th century, it's really true, because there's not as much irony in the culture to start with. But it is a fascinating procedure. And what I feel is happening is we're tapping into something that's always been hidden. It's been suggested and looked at by different researchers. It's been let out by mystery schools and their public counterparts, things like theosophy or anthroposophy, but it's never been really solved and put out there in a way that we could read it. And the thing about steganography is once it's out of the bag, it's out of the bag. Once we can see it, all these other dots start to connect. It's one of those types of situations. So we really do break the code in a sense. Now, what I do want to say about tonight's show is it is definitely where the esoteric meets the kind of high-tech, exotic tech, these two coming together. And it's kind of a mind blower in this sense, in that we have to go really deep on the esoteric side to understand what the other thing is. But it also relates to Pine Gap, which is basically the world's most powerful listening station. It's run by the US in Australia. And it's had a reputation for, it came out in the Snowden documents that they were running a program called X Keyscore, which literally could dive into any conversation anywhere in the world at any time, between any foreign leader or between any individual, whatever it happened to be. So it was like Bluffdale on megaton steroids. But I would say that this has always been an interesting thing, because Pine Gap originally, when it was started in the 60s, and we'll find out that the foundations of it were laid even earlier. And we're going to find that out through a very strange source, which many of you may have guessed at by looking at the thumbnail, which is a reference to this remarkable little book called A Wrinkle in Time. And of course, this has been made into a movie now, where Oprah is playing this incredible supernatural character leading these children on this quest. And it's Madeleine L'engle, and she is going to be, it's such a fascinating thing to explore her life and how she's really, she's really a modern spiritualist. And that's the interesting thing about this book also, because although it's an incredibly popular children's book, it is on one hand scorned by traditional kind of atheistic, secular organizations and young adult schools because it's too religious. But then the religious schools say, well, it's full of too much witchcraft and hocus pocus. So it was really coming down this middle line. Incredible secrets in this book. And we're going to get into it tonight and how it relates to the X Steganography and things that I've discovered about Pine Gap that goes far back as Shakespeare, which is where they got the name for Pine Gap in the first place. Okay, and that's going to be pretty exciting. And then we're going to get into a big key aspect of this, which is something called the dweller on the threshold, which is a concept that comes out of esoteric literature, predominantly theosophy and anthroposophy again, but it was first debuted in public by Bulwer Lytton, who we've gone into before. Was just a fascinating British writer who was also a politician. And one of the other books that's going to make some headway tonight is this book, which is the autobiography of Emma Hardinge Britten. And Emma, of course, I've covered in a previous show dealing with Annie Besant. And she was a real incredible spiritualist, but she gave us an incredible gift in this book. And I'm so glad that it was there and that she put it in there, which is all about Bulwer Lytton's association with something called the Orphic Circle, which was an incredibly secret occult group in the 1840s, and how they had used her as a young adult between the ages of about 11 to 13 as a somnambulist channel to get these messages and to get information of a variety of things, not only about the nature of reality, but even state secrets and things of that nature. So her life is something to behold, and I've tried to emphasize just how important she is in terms of what we're trying to discover here. So Emma Britten's going to come in incredibly handy. The other book that's going to really fuel our fire tonight is something called the Scarlett Book of Freemasonry. I'm lucky enough to have a first edition here. And, you know, it's a strange thing because this is a fairly rare book, and there's a lot of gifts in here as well for what we're looking for, specifically, oddly enough, in Chapter X. And also in Chapter X of Knowledge of Higher Worlds, it just so happens that everything that we're looking for tonight is in Chapter X of both those books. So now I think we have the lay of the land as far as a brief sketch goes of the X stuff. And of course, what you want to do is go back to the beginning X series. I have a playlist that's set up here on YouTube, or if you go to darkjournalist.com, and certainly our subscribers have all those episodes, audio and video, with explanations of what they are. But you want to be able to watch those. And while I mention the site, I should say that when you go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, because that's the best way you and I can stay in touch beyond the social media platforms. And just go there and sign up. The newsletter is free. And what happens is about once a week, you'll get an update, and it'll tell you what shows are coming up and who the guests are. And we have some very exciting guests coming up. So that's what you really want to be doing. Interestingly enough, one of the guests that we have coming up that we did a show with was Catherine Austin Fitz, who is now in Australia and not too far from Pine Gap, doing a little Australian outback. So we're going to get a big update on that from her when she comes back. But let's go into Pine Gap for a minute. Pine Gap was started by America in Australia under the auspices of being a space observation center, which is how they originally tagged it. And the Prime Minister at the time was going along with us on a number of things, like troops to Vietnam and things like that. But as 1968 approached, things weren't going so well in Vietnam, and he was wondering if LBJ hadn't suckered him in, because LBJ was saying, hey, I'm not even going to run for president again. So he was starting to back away from LBJ, and he's starting to back away from this idea of having this space observatory in Pine Gap that he knew was going to be used to spy on our counterparts there in Asia and the Soviet Union. So he was starting to pull away, and strangely enough, mysteriously enough, he disappeared. And they came up with the idea that he disappeared while swimming, which is interesting because he was an excellent expert swimmer. And there's always been a great mystery about it, because there was never any body that was produced. And one of the things I found out in exploring that is that when you don't have a body, you don't have an inquest to try to get the details of what happened. If there's no body, you just close it as an accident case, and that was that. But Holt, who was the Prime Minister, set a pattern there that, defying this very key, very crucial Pine Gap base, could be have heavy-duty ramifications. But one thing I want to mention before we get into all the ramifications of Pine Gap is that in Australia, over and over again, whether I was working on the esoteric side or whether I was working on the high-tech side or the black budget technology side, everything kept going back to Australia. And over and over again, Pine Gap, of course, but Australia was definitely in the heart of all this research. And I could not get over, you might see trends here and there that will go to a particular place, but just that everything was grouping around Australia every time I was really digging in on the X fascinated me, and I kept on that trail. And that's one of the reasons we're here tonight. And you're going to find out tonight that Steiner's work, Bulwer Lytton's work, Emma Harding's work, the work on that wonderful children's book, A Wrinkle in Time, all of it goes back to Australia. And it's all the very next chapter of our X Steganography story. So this X series, really what I'm arriving at with all the research is that Australia is right in the bullseye of the research. Whatever it is that's going on with that X, it's moved. A lot of people talk about Area 51, and at times we've heard things about, let's do a protest at Area 51. For my money, based on my research, you're not going to find anything there except kind of remnants of what they were working on. It seems to me that they've moved it out and beyond where people can get their hands on it. And of course, in Australia, you have a number of groups who protest the base, not because they think they're working on the UFO file there, but just because of all the political ramifications of the eavesdropping and the incredible NSA, CIA presence that happens there. So Pine Gap during the 1970s, so let's get a quick look at what we're talking about. These kind of dome shapes. And, they're quite incredible when you think about it. There is a kind of an otherworldly feeling just looking at them. I'll give us another shot with a bigger picture. Let's take a look. And one of the things I want to say about it is these are the most advanced listening stations anywhere in the world. And what Snowden revealed in X Keyscore, which that's the name of the program, X Keyscore. So we have that X being used. One of the other things I found out that I have to admit I have not completely solved is the code name in those documents for the base is Merino, which is the name of the sheep. Now, a really incredible, elaborate type of sheep. I've got a picture of one here. So it's an interesting thing to use for a code name. Why would you call it that? Well, interestingly enough, it takes 4 strains of sheep to make this particular incredible wool. So there's a whole hybrid question that goes on here. There's also the idea of shearing the sheep to make the products, which these things could be allusions to working on exotic technology that is obtained through the UFO file that is worked on at Pine Gap. And the reason I even suggest this, of course, is Pine Gap has an incredible history of UFO sightings, as does Australia. But this might give us the key to the name. It's a hard one to figure out because, of course, there's only a few good interpretations, and we're not inside of their NSA codebreaker mind. However, I do think it's clear that the sheep is a hybrid, 1, and 2, they produce an incredible product with it by working on it. So that's enough for me to get started with. But one of the things that we discover is that this character, let's look at the logo first. That is the logo for Pine Gap. Very clearly an X, and ties in very much to, let's see, is that a good, that's a great shot of that. It ties in very much to what we've seen when we've gone into really deep mystery schools and going back to that whole period of the Eleusinian mysteries. And you have the Plato's cosmic X show up on all these coins and everywhere else, and it looks exactly the same. So it's obviously an allusion to that. And we see that it has this kind of intimidating idea of just crisscrossing the entire globe and locking it in, very much like the space fence, which we cover quite a bit on this show. This is a shot of a spot of a mountain close to Pine Gap, and you can see there's an entrance there that you can easily cover up with brush, and no one would ever know it even existed. But someone got a shot of it while it was open. And I think that gives us, again, that little sort of Area 51 feeling right there, which is whatever they're working on is highly, highly secret. Now, one of the other things that we're going to discover tonight is there's something that's referred to as an ultra room at Pine Gap. And the ultra room is something that no one but Americans can go into, and only one person at a time. My guess is that beyond the incredible spy work that's going on there at Pine Gap, that this relates very much to the UFO file, and that it's something that's going to come in very crucial, which is why it's in the title in the first place. How are we doing over there, Olivia?
Doing great.
Okay.
Lively crowd.
Fantastic. It's great to have everyone here. Like I said, it's Friday night, and it's Dark Journalist Live. I do feel like Friday nights are kind of, we've gotten into the groove now because, it took us a while to figure out what night would be right for us. And Friday just has always been my favorite on this. Let's take a look at Gough Whitlam. Gough Whitlam was the Prime Minister of Australia for 4 years, from 71 to 75. And he was quite a reformist character, but he was almost like a Bernie Sanders type. He's like free college, all these work programs. And, he was really incredibly socialistically minded. And he really irked the royals at the time with his programs. And he was really playing it loose. And he even had his own visit to China. He was a very kind of up and coming character, and he wanted independence for Australia. And they knew that, and they were particularly worried about him because he wanted to get rid of Pine Gap. So the Queen moved into a situation with the Governor General, and they used this obscure, and I mean obscure, piece of law back there from when Australia was first founded, in order to have the duly elected Prime Minister, Whitlam, dismissed by the Governor General. And this was always a very behind-the-scenes thing, and the royalty always says, oh, we had nothing to do with it. It was a problem there that they were having. But this was all over Pine Gap to show you that the importance... Now, of course, Whitlam was irking them in other ways, but Pine Gap was the kind of straw that broke the camel's back, very much like the UFO file in relation to the Kennedy assassination. It's a situation where it's a bridge too far, because if they lose that edge, that advantage of what they're going to do with this redeveloped energy source and with this X technology, then they lose all their advantage for the future. Now, I do want to stress here a point, which is in 1974, before Nixon is taken out of office, basically by the deep state, and, kind of using his own mistakes against him for sure. But certainly other presidents have done a number of the things that Nixon did and didn't get into trouble for it. So, the trick is, do you get caught? Well, you get caught when the deep state wants to get you out of there. And one of the things that he did was, there were these series of articles that came out in something called The Nation in Australia. And I have copies of these, which I have shown on the program, and I'll show them again tonight. But they talk about how Pine Gap working on secret energy source for Nixon. So it was well known. It was sort of coming out, maybe even through the workers who were working there at Pine Gap. Sometimes we hear about things on the Area 51 side that just slip out to the media, like Bob Lazar type characters. But in any case, that was there. And the idea was he was going to announce some huge energy change, breakthrough energy shift in 1975. Well, of course, he's thrown out in 74, and then Whitlam pretty much right after him, about 6 to 8 months later. So, we're looking at a situation where they need to get these people out of the way for whatever reason. Now, Nixon, in my estimation, may have been moving faster than the deep state or the people who control these types of moves in society were comfortable with. The problem with the corporation is that it was endlessly innovative. This is the nature of the beast. So that in the corporation, in this case, was the production of this exotic technology. So what we have is a situation by 1975 where Pine Gap has become incredibly important. And it's been there ostensibly for 8 years, but as we'll find, it actually goes back further than that, from when they scouted it out and all the rest of it, and references to it. Now, I found some unusual things relating to Pine Gap. One of them was that the base that was supporting it was something called Prospero. And that also they had launched the Prospero satellite, which immediately was their most advanced satellite. And by the way, Australia was only the third nation to launch satellites in the first place. So a very early adopter there, along with the Soviet Union and America. But in any case, what happened was they launched this Prospero satellite, and it's going out now for 100 years. But instantly it loses communication, which is very unusual. And it has this problem. So now it's doing this other thing. It's still out there, but who knows who's communicating with it. Something very unusual about Prospero. And to be honest with you, it bothered me a little bit because I was thinking, you know, these things work together very often, and you have to kind of use an investigator's mind and hold back your imagination to a degree. But at the same time, you have to allow yourself to make those connections about what is it that's really going on there. So I went back reading Prospero, who's a character in Shakespeare's The Tempest. And while I was doing that, I found all these references to pines and gaps. And I started to realize that they were giving it away, that they had this steganography going on relating to Prospero and Shakespeare in the development of these bases, which I found very interesting. And I'm going to read the section that's involved here. And we'll just get a little bit of Prospero. And anyone who's seen The Tempest, this is a very interesting and unusual play. It's the last real play for Shakespeare, and it has some of his most famous names, you know, some of his most famous sayings in there, like "We are the stuff that dreams are made on," and things of this nature. But anyway, I grabbed these quotes directly from it, and this is Prospero speaking. And Prospero frees the spirit Ariel, and Ariel is going to become very important here when we are dealing with Pine Gap. And if we can go into this kind of esoteric zone dealing with Pine Gap, we're going to understand the technological aspect much, much better. Okay, so you know, Prospero is a sorcerer himself, and he's frees the spirit Ariel from entrapment from a cloven pine. Let's start there. About which Prospero states, "It was mine art, when I arrived and heard thee, that made thee gape, the pine, and let thee out." Now, you've got gape and pine right there, and then cloven pine, which means there's a gap in the pine. So Pine Gap, the name is there, and then we have Prospero, which is the name of the base that supplies Pine Gap, and the name of the satellite, the most advanced one that Australia has that goes out, and is still out there, but it no longer communicates with the people it was supposed to be communicating with. It's now in some kind of secret channel. As a matter of fact, I found out that in 2012, a group of scientists had contacted it, and it was sending them information. So it's just rolling around out there. God knows exactly what that was all about. Some of you might remember SpaceX sending up the very unusual space satellite that got into trouble and supposedly crashed last December. Very similar type of situation. I always wonder about those cases. But in any case, there's a whole bunch of things relating to Prospero, but I'm going to read a little bit more here of what he's saying at the end. And this is another famous line, which "Our revels now are ended. These are actors, as I foretold you, were all spirits, and are melted into air, into thin air. And like the baseless fabric of this vision, the cloud-capped towers, the gorgeous palaces, the solemn temples, the great globe itself. Yea, all which it inherits shall dissolve, and like this insubstantial pageant faded. Leave not a rack behind, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." So very esoteric imagery going on there, but definitely allusions to the air, allusions to the fact of kind of Maya illusion, which is the world is an illusion and we need to get beyond it, and the great globe itself and all that we inherit shall dissolve. these are the kind of heavy themes that are going on with Prospero and Shakespeare. Now, one of the key things I think that we need to keep in mind is that when we're dealing with steganography of this type, when they are naming things as a reference, 9 times out of 10, they will have a secondary stage where something else will spin off from that, and we'll understand, oh, there's another piece of that Shakespeare steganography that they're using. And in fact, there's a lot of it. So one other quick thing I'll point out is close by, well, not really that close. Maybe someone pointed out it was 150 miles away. But something like an alien, it's a place like they do around Area 51 where they'll watch for UFOs and things like that. And this is one of those. It's about 100 to 150 miles from the base at Pine Gap. But just to show you that over there, it's understood that if you're around Pine Gap, you're going to be looking at UFOs, and it's just kind of the common thing. As a matter of fact, I have a real detailed description. This is somebody's working the graffiti there in Australia for us. It's really good. And then this one was an actual craft that was videotaped. Oh, I think let's do it this way. Coming out of the base. And the base itself is very unusual. Not that large, but has an incredible impact. And in the middle of nowhere. Let's put it that way, near a town called Alice Springs. I want to read you something in relation to this, which is about some of the mysteries of the Pine Gap UFO sightings. Let's get into those. So, yeah, it's kind of fascinating because the purpose of Pine Gap really, the way that it's stated, just doesn't add up. And this is one of the really interesting things about it. But these are the sightings, I think, that are important. There's a lot to choose from. But, okay, these are the ones that are important. Another type of sighting involves blue, red, and gold pencil-like beams. So there's these thin beams that come out. They're blue. They're gold. They're red. And they're not crafts per se, but there are these beams that just emanate off the base. So several other incidents of a similar nature, which were reported by visitors in the area. And in one case in 1975, the occupants of a passenger plane, which was passing some 18 miles to the east of the base, observed a large white object, similar in size to one of the white radomes. So, like one of those domes flown around. Let's take a look. How would we like to see one of those flying? I mean, it would be kind of impressive. So this is pretty interesting. Suddenly, it leapt into the air and disappeared rapidly towards the northwest. As everyone on the plane was interested in seeing what Pine Gap looked like, most of the passengers and crew witnessed the events. When the pilots reported the incident, everyone on the plane was interviewed and told not to talk about it. It came out later. So it sounds to me like they're controlling the details there because they're doing some kind of test themselves. So we've got one type of situation there, which is what Pine Gap is, and they're redeveloping the UFO file there. But then what about the steps to cover it up? And what did they do in the case of Gough Whitlam? And why did they dismiss him? Why would they take that kind of constitutional crisis? And it's still called the dismissal, and it's well known from 1975 that they did this to Whitlam, who was a very popular politician, like I said, a la Bernie Sanders. And there, of course, was Prime Minister Hart, who disappeared while drowning. But before he did, he had a little bit of a time with LBJ about 6 months earlier, before they turned on each other. So we can see it's when people start disappearing, it's a hot button issue. And that's really kind of a good basic rule. Okay, the Ultra Room relating to Pine Gap's UFO file and redevelopment of this X technology. So this article, and there's several of them, this one comes from The Guardian in England, talking in depth about this room. And the name of the article is Revealed: The Room Inside Pine Gap No Australian Could Enter, Bar 1. And that's just to give you an idea of the headline, if you can read that. And an old U.S. diplomatic cable uncovered by the Privacy International has confirmed the existence of a secret room at America's Pine Gap spy base that Australians were not allowed to enter except for one time when Bill Hayden had a look. It calls into question a claim made at the time in March 1985 by then Defense Minister Kim Beazley, who said the government was fully aware of everything that takes place at Pine Gap near Ellis Springs in the Northern Territory. The cable was released, the Privacy Act, basically, they had work in there, to the U.S. State Department after a lawsuit seeking access, by the U.S. State Department, after a lawsuit seeking access to the details of the scope of intelligence gathering across the globe. Now, they said it was a case study of how intelligence sharing arrangements are typically confidential and not subject to parliamentary scrutiny. Basically, what they're saying is, they were able to circumvent the laws in this case that would make it classified. It slipped through the cracks. So now we understand that there's a room there, this ultra room, where only Americans are allowed. And as we go deeper into it, it seems that only one person is allowed in there at a time. What does that mean? You have to wonder about that. How ultra secret could it be? And one of the things about those security clearances is it's true that if you're an Australian working at a U.S. spy base, you still are covered by the Immense Secrecy Act. But there is a secrecy that applies to us as American citizens working on these that might be a step beyond. So it might be the ultimate, safety provision that they're just not going to allow anyone who's not an American inside that room. And the ultra room is, that's a kind of a slang. It's not really, we don't know the official name of the room. That's not in any document. That's just something that was picked up, basically. So we can imagine when we think about this, again, going back to some of these early articles, and I have a better picture of this that I will print out next time, but that's just to know, that's the article from 1974 talking about how Pine Gap is doing sci-fi research. They say for Tricky Dick, because he was having a lot of problems at the time. So let's think back to that and think, an ultra room, all these UFO sightings, Nixon talking about doing this disclosure during this period, and all this kerfuffle around Gough Whitlam, getting Gough Whitlam out of there because he wants to close Pine Gap, which is ostensibly an American military base, spying base in the heart of Australia. Now, let's go to see the moves that they made to do this. Now, as we know, the Queen was operating with the Governor General. Now we know that. At the time, it was a complete secret, and still largely secret, and they still deny it up and down. This is the Queen visiting in 1975 in Australia. And this is the year that Whitlam got thrown out. And what happened is, while making a biography on Whitlam, his author decided to basically do the version of the Freedom of Information Act over there. And he went and said, I want these letters that the Queen wrote to the Governor General. Well, they said, no, they're covered by all these different rules and all the rest of it. And, you can't have them. It's a private letter, basically. This is what they said it was. And he said, no, it wasn't a private letter. It was instructions to fire Gough Whitlam and get him out of there as the prime minister so they wouldn't close Pine Gap. And so there was this whole kerfuffle, and it became a huge court case, which I'll just read a tiny little bit of here. On Friday, the federal court handed down its judgment in my action, he's the author who made this request, against the National Archives of Australia, seeking the release of the palace letters between the Queen and the Governor General, Sir John Carr, regarding the Whitlam dismissal. In a stark decision, Justice John Griffiths held that these historically significant letters, written at a time that he recognized as one of the most controversial and tumultuous events in the modern history of the nation, should remain secret, although Griffiths noticed the clear public interest in the content of the records. Gee, it sounds like yesterday's Kennedy dismissal, where we didn't get the records and Trump bowed to the CIA, so So much for that. And this is the kind of thing where they say a little thing like, we understand the public's interested, but hey, we do understand your interest and thank you for being interested, but go home. So, and that happened with the palace letters. Now these letters, they've said everything from, they've leaked everything out there. Like, oh, they could be love letters. That's why she doesn't want them out. And, all these ridiculous notions. It has nothing to do with that. Very likely in here are instructions directly from the Queen to the Governor General to get rid of Gough Whitlam over the issue of Pine Gap. And that's why you would take great pains to hide it. Even now, there are moves in Australia to get free of the fact that back there is this idea that royalty can come in at any minute, snap their fingers, and change the government in Australia, because they did it once, and they did it in 1975 because of Pine Gap. So we get something, and it goes very deep in the article, the different things. This guy's been working since 2014 to get these records out, and the different strange, bizarre excuses they've come up with to block the case and delay it and all the rest of it. I highly recommend getting into it. And I think the Queen's letters to the Governor General in 1975 is one of those areas, kind of like the Kennedy assassination with America, that until the UK gets that, until Australia gets it, it's going to be, rule by secrecy, and the transparency factor is going to be way off. But for our purposes, what are they hiding? And it goes right into the heart of the X technology and what the X represents. Because remember, it's not just technology, it's the effect that this UFO file causes. What is the effect? And that's the thing that we need to look at. One of the things I want to talk about here is going to take us into very interesting territory. And before we do, I'm going to check in on the chat. How are you doing over there?
Doing great. Got a little troll action, but it's okay.
Patrol the trolls. I always say this: if there are any trolls out there from 3-letter agencies using 4-letter words, we've got a 5-star spam general. So you're toast. You're toast. But I've seen a lot of that activity lately, and the more we do these X reports, frankly, the more it's increased. And the less we pay attention to it. But people are you getting questions and stuff?
Yes,
are people
excellent questions.
Good? You can throw a question right now while I get this next section ready if you want to.
Well, Kate Kelly was asking, how do you keep so many people quiet? And the Pine Gap staff send their children to local schools. Why?
Yeah, that is all very interesting. You keep them quiet with secrecy oaths, which say basically you'll go to prison for X amount of years, which is why when people roll out of the woodwork like Luis Elizondo with TTSA, it's a joke, and I can tell you why. Or various guys who come out and say, hey, I was doing autopsies on aliens, but now I'm free because my secrecy it doesn't work that way. And a lot of those people use those types of excuses because it's part of a kind of a script. But really, most secrecy agreements last 20 years, and some of them last forever. Like many of these ex-CIA people come out and try to write books, and the CIA still has to review the book. And if they don't like certain things, they take them out. So how much truth are you really getting? The other thing, though, is just the disruption involved. And they'll say, well, you'll lose your pension. Maybe even if you expose some of this stuff and we don't prosecute you, you're going to lose, basically it's going to look bad for you. So there's a lot of incentives in there to stay quiet, and getting quiet in a different country when you're dealing with Americans working solely at the base and you're looking at NSA and CIA officials is pretty easy, frankly. And the Falcon and the Snowman is an interesting case on that, because when you look at it and you look at that story, you're seeing that the weak link in the chain was an American who was not working at the base, but was just getting the transmissions from it. So I think when you look at it that way, the people that are in Australia, it's pretty easy to keep their mouths shut. Did you have more on that?
Nope, that was it for now.
Excellent. Okay, now everybody's seen Disney's been pushing a movie lately. It's called A Wrinkle in Time, and there is one of the heroines in there, Oprah. She's back, and she's badder than ever. And we remember Oprah from a lot of different ways. Of course, she did her book club stuff, and she did some remarkable things in TV talk land. And but she also worked very hard in the political end of the spectrum. She became part of the Billionaires Club, and it's just a tricky legacy there, but certainly she accomplished a lot. One of the things I think we can say about Oprah is this is a real reemergence for her, because she's been really under the radar completely. But that book is very, very interesting, because the author of that book, who we introduced earlier, and it's quite a good book, Madeleine L'engle's book, A Wrinkle in Time. It's from 1961. There is Madeleine L'engle, kind of a dreamy type and very intelligent and very highly spiritual. And she had a series of very unusual, experiences as growing up. And she was moved around a lot, like in the Swiss Alps and France and all these private schools. And when she talks about it, it's kind of wistful, that she's talking about she's sort of dislocated in all these different types of environments, but she's picking up a great education, and her parents are moving through Europe a lot. And then her dad, who's a writer himself, gets ill, and they move to America. And she says something very interesting about the writing of this book. And I think it's going to be a big key. The book is full of incredible keys. And I want to thank so many people who've pointed the book out. Now, one of the things that came up in relation to this is her description of this time in her life and what was happening. Now, she's talking about how it came to be that she wrote it. She says, "As we drove through a world of deserts and leafless mountains," this is our 10-week camping trip across the country and back again. And she was driving around with her family, the Franklins. So she's taking this trip, and she's going through deserts and leafless mountains, and she says, "It's wholly new and alien world opened up to me." So the use of the word alien there I thought was very interesting. And suddenly into my mind the names Mrs. Whatsit, Mrs. Who, and Mrs. Which came. Now, this was the spring of 1959, and L'engle was reading about quantum physics at the time, which also made its way into the story. And what happens is it's a very interesting setup, because what happens is the main character, her father, disappears into this wrinkle in time, and he's a physicist who's working on this secret project for the government. Now, as it turns out, she has this kind of quest to find him, and it's this whole thing about him being missing. And out of the blue, these three incredible women show up who are like spirits, basically. And her mother are freaked out, and her little brother and their friend. So you have all these things that happen where these characters say, "Look, your dad has passed into this wrinkle in time because of the work he was doing. And we can get him back, but we have to do all these things in order to do it." And part of that includes going to this other planet with these people. And it's a very entertaining story. But the hardcore aspects, I think, that relate to what we're talking about, right off the bat, L'engle starts the book. This is the first major clue. She starts the book, which it was a dark and stormy night, which is the ultimate cliche line from Bulwer Lytton that he started all these books with, and it became this 19th century cliche. It was a dark and stormy night. The links to Bulwer Lytton and his style of approach in here are hardcore, but also what's interesting is he was a big influence on her, and she, researching his life and all the rest of it, came into contact with her own kind of network of secret societies. Now, interestingly enough, Bulwer Lytton was outed there by Emma Britton. But all of the real groups that dealt with the mystery school movement, like Theosophy, like Anthroposophy, they all knew he was an adept of some kind. And Steiner said he had to be incredibly highly advanced. So this Orphic Circle idea that came up through Emma Britton, which I've described as almost like a MyLab type thing, where they were using these young teenage girls to get these psychic channel things going, is fascinating. And she was one of them, as she stated in her book. She was really right in the very heart of this. And let's take a quick look at Emma. Emma had incredible natural psychic ability. And I'll quickly recap her thing with the Orphic Circle is that when she would go into these parlors and these little setups there that they had for her, they had scoped her out. And in her autobiography, she talks about how they don't let her play with other kids. She has a very strange life. You know, they influence her to play music. And when she plays music, she gets like somebody who's kind of playing the music through her, and all these unusual things happen. And then out of the blue, her dad dies, and that connection kind of moves, and they make her become an actress, and she's out of the picture from the Orphic Circle. But she talks about these different characters and how she was not allowed to say anything about who they were, and that she had to kind of swear allegiance to them. And even at the end of her life, when she's writing the autobiography, she's not giving it away except for those who have died. And some of them who have died included Bulwer Lytton and a few others that she mentions. But she talks about how the really highest ranking political officials in England at the time were there, along with the leading citizens, so authors and playwrights and all the rest of it. The kind of cream of the crop of the society were there doing these really heavy-duty channeling sessions. And apparently they got out of hand at times, and they channeled beings, and all kinds of poltergeist activity happened and all the rest of it. And this kind of psychic disturbance lingered with her after her father's death, and she wound up moving to New York and has an incredible life. And we'll do just an episode dedicated to her at some point because it's so fascinating. But for our purposes, she opened us up to this idea of Bulwer Lytton. Bulwer Lytton, we've always known that he's been involved in these occult circles, but we've never known much about the Orphic Circle. It's always been a rather large-scale mystery. Let's get a quick biography sketch of Bulwer Lytton. Crucial. Bulwer Lytton talked all about the airships. He talked about deep underground bases. This is all in the 1840s, 1850s. Books like The Coming Race talked about Vril, which was this incredible energy source, and how there was a super race living underneath that was going to overthrow the group on top. There are all sorts of mystery school and Rosicrucian mysteries that are revealed in his work. And so Bulwer Lytton, he was a patient, he was an English novelist, poet, playwright, and politician. He was the first Baron Lytton, 1803 to 1873, to give you some idea. And there's a fascinating line about Rudolf Steiner, who was the person who was a leader in theosophy and then broke off and did anthroposophy and started his own Steiner schools and built the Goetheanum and things like that. He left an incredible legacy working in things like biodynamic farming and eurythmy, which is a series of movements. It's kind of like movement therapy, dance, and mystical dance. And, you know, just an incredible legacy of teachings dealing with culture and the threefold nature of society, but incredible esoteric writings. Being a scholar and being a really advanced person, one of the things that he observed about the circle that Bulwer Lytton was in was that Bulwer Lytton's maternal grandfather was Philip Henry Stanhope, who'd been a close friend of Bulwer Lytton and a member of the occultic Orphic Circle. So he's in there. He's one of these people that Emma can't identify. Philip Henry Stanhope was a secret agent and a lifelong keen researcher into the occult. Now, they talk about how Bulwer Lytton was very close to Benjamin Disraeli and Rosebery, who both of these gentlemen will become prime ministers in England. So talking about the top rank there. And interestingly enough, for Disraeli, he's the only Jewish prime minister of England, although, you know, his father was Jewish, and then he became some kind of Calvinist. But basically, you know, in terms of actually being Jewish, he's the only Jewish prime minister that the UK ever had. And so he's fascinating for that reason. But one of the things when speaking about Bulwer Lytton and Rosebery that Rudolf Steiner says is this very interesting little quote, and it's exactly what this series is all about. He says, Rosebery himself was not particularly important, but he was an individual who was backed by various concealed groups. The firm doctrine that had come into being in the secret brotherhoods must be heard resounding in the words of Rosebery, for we must learn to look in the right places. And really, with us right now, with what we're looking at with the X Steganography, we have to learn to look in the right places. That's what Steiner's telling us. But it is very fascinating. And Rosebery turns into kind of an interesting nationalistic and somewhat unpopular leader in the UK. But I think Steiner's observations regarding him and Bulwer-Lytton are worth a major mention there. So let's look at the book that is basically the early version of A Wrinkle in Time. And that's Zanoni, which is Bulwer-Lytton's incredible novel. Let's see if we can get this picture. Containing all these mystical truths and these kind of Rosicrucian secret brotherhood truths. And what happens is this character shows up and is giving him all these mystical ideas, and he puts him in a number of situations, and he says, if you really want to find these different secrets, you're going to have to go through these trials. And one of the trials, this is another just incredible shot from this book. Just take a look at that. I mean, does that doesn't even look like it's something from the 19th century. It looks almost like an airship war going down. But you know what he was basically, he was so advanced in the things that he was putting out and talking in terms of Vril and all these other secret energy sources, that this is a big key to what was happening inside those groups. Because as I pointed out in previous shows, all this stuff about Atlantean airships starts to come up through these different movements. The Theosophists, Anthroposophists, Edgar Cayce will eventually talk about it. Dweller on Two Planets, which is a major book, has this whole section about airships. As a matter of fact, in one of the sections in that book, which I think is written maybe about 1898, somewhere in there, there's this character who gets kind of, you know, you could say he's bummed out, and he walks down to his flying machine, and he's, you know, thinking about things, and he gets into it, and he's flying up in space, and then he's flying underwater. You know, I mean, it's very unusual, this airship. The leanings towards it, the mentionings, you know, the little references that are happening all around these airships. So with Bulwer-Lytton, I think that what we're really getting in Zanoni are all these different hidden truths. Now, one of the things that happens in that book, which is so pertinent to the Wrinkle in Time book and gives us a real answer that links all the way back to Pine Gap. And like I said, we're really going to spin the table tonight because these things are really going to come together. Figure called the Dweller on the Threshold. The Dweller on the Threshold is an esoteric concept that Bulwer-Lytton lets out in one of these books, and Rudolf Steiner catches it because he's an adept himself. And he says, So not only does he know this stuff, but he let it out. It's one of these secrets. This was Steiner's drawing interpretation of the Dweller on the Threshold. Very kind of ominous figure back there. It's kind of like, you shall not pass into these esoteric mystical gates without getting through me. And Steiner, in fact, points out that no one dealing with real advancement on the mystical side is going to do anything without getting past this Dweller on the Threshold. So it's one of those etheric experiences, mystical experiences that needs to be gone through. And it's something that happened to Steiner when he was a young man. And this is an interesting kind of snapshot of Steiner as a younger guy who met one of these masters who showed him how to do this, basically. And that's a very interesting story in itself, and we will tell some of that here. That's another flash of Steiner. I show this one a lot. That's probably the picture that describes him the best. And just one more to kind of give us that idea of, this is a shot of Steiner with Besant when he was still with Theosophy before he broke away and did Theosophy on his own. And of course, Besant is a major figure in Theosophy who we did a whole show on a couple of X episodes ago. So this Dweller on the Threshold becomes the crux of it, because one of the things I want to point out about our author here, and You know, the thing about Madeleine L'engle, really, just take a quick look at her again. This is somebody who was seeking kind of a mystical world. And when she talks, she's masking a kind of spiritualism. But she was associated with these various groups. And one of the groups was an offshoot of the Knights of Malta. And here they have a crest, which is very fascinating. Let's see if this X shows up. Well, there it is. It's in here. If you can see it in there. Let's see. This is the group that she's a part of. And she has the honorary title of Dame in it. And she's basically the equivalent of an honorary knight in this group. And there's a lot of occult symbolism and things that swirl around this. But I'm going to tie this in to the Dweller on the Threshold. So let's get a quick idea of what this Dweller on the Threshold is from, let's go right to Steiner himself. Well, first we'll start off with Theosophy's version of the Dweller on the Threshold. So the Dweller on the Threshold is a character in Edward Bulwer-Lytton's novel Zanoni. It's a malevolent entity that embodies the sum of all darkness a person has accumulated throughout the incarnations he or she has lived. So that gives us a quick idea. It's kind of facing your shadow. And we've seen this replayed in every movie from Star Wars to every other movie. So according to Blavatsky's view, this is how she says it. Dweller on the Threshold, a term used by Bulwer-Lytton and Zanoni, but in occultism, the word dweller is an occult term used by students for long ages past and refers to certain maleficent astral doubles of defunct persons. So it's an astral double, which means it embodies that whole shadow self. It is, you know, basically not only are you taking on evil, you're taking on your own evil, which is quite, you know, this is an extra challenge, because if we look at one thing and we might say, you know, evil is out there and we're projecting evil out there. And we see so much of this now in the media, you know, like, oh, they say Trump is evil, you know, and then the Trump people say, well, they're evil, you know, and so everybody's evil. But of course, there's real evil in the world, but you start dealing with that and getting a handle on it by facing your own shadow. And that's what this type of work is all about. Now, how does the Dweller on the Threshold relate to what we're talking about? Let's go a little deeper. In rare cases, says Blavatsky, something far more dreadful can happen. That is, than confronting your lower nature. When the lower manas, and that's a term in Theosophy, so I won't go too deeply into that part. When the lower manas is doomed to exhaust itself by starvation, when there's no longer hope that even a remnant of a lower light will, even a short period of spiritual aspiration and repentance, will attract back to itself its parent ego, then karma leads the higher ego back to new incarnations. In this case, the kama manasic spook may become that which we call in occultism the Dweller on the Threshold. This dweller is not like that which is described so graphically in Zanoni, but in actual fact in nature, not a fiction, however beautiful the latter may be. Bulwer-Lytton may have gotten the idea from some Eastern initiate, but our dweller is led by affinity and inhabited by a parent ego. When it declares war on a lower light, it has replaced it. So this is kind of deep esoteric doctrine, but what she's basically saying is, in the worst case scenario, rather than just confronting your fears and moving on, there's actually a chance, and she does describe that this can only happen in the case of moral weakness of the personality being in this confrontation, and no one who has strong virtue or righteous in his walk of life can risk or dread any such thing, but only those who are depraved. So, you know, you get this really depraved individual, and when they're passing this test, the thing actually possesses them. And that's the worst possible scenario, the way that she's outlining. So we can see that there's a real psychological trial involved with the Dweller on the Threshold. Now, interestingly enough, in his most popular work, Steiner, who put out the book Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment, Knowledge of Higher Worlds is his most basic book. there is no Steiner book like it. It has actual instructions for raising your consciousness and things like that. And, if you know Steiner's work, it's incredibly complete, but it's complex to a degree that is really beyond description. And so to have a kind of a simple workbook from him is remarkable. And it works. It's kind of like his hit single book, it's sort of the easy one to digest. And then, we also have to deal with his incredible, deep instrumental albums also. But as we can say in Knowledge of Higher Worlds, I want to point this out just because it's humorous, but that is, just like I'm going to read you later, it is the X chapter for that, which is kind of fascinating. And that X chapter will show up in this Masonic book with the crucial information for the second half of this show. So, so what he says is when you're facing this guardian of the threshold as a student, quote, a truly terrible spectral being confronts you, and you will need all the presence of mind and faith in the security of your path, which you've had ample opportunity to acquire in the course of your training. So it's kind of the moment of truth when you've done, your spiritual work and you go and face this guardian of the threshold. The guardian proclaims his signification somewhat in the following words. Quote, this is the guardian on the threshold talking now. Hitherto, powers invisible to thyself watched over thee. They saw to it that in the course of thy lives, each of thy good deeds brought its reward, and each of thy evil deeds was attended by its evil results. Thanks to their influence, thy character formed itself out of thy life experiences and thy thoughts. They were the instruments of thy destiny. They ordained the measure of joy and pain allotted to thee in thine incarnations. And now moving down. What happens from here is that he basically says, you're going to have to stand on your own. You're not going to have any supporting forces, all those things that helped you build your character. Now it's basically you and me, and I can do anything to you. I can, I look just like you, or I'm an ugly, incredible, monstrous manifestation. I can be your double. I can be, your seducer. I can do all these different things. So there's a whole kind of dance here of the guardian of the threshold that takes place. Now, interestingly enough, when we get into this dweller on the threshold, who's also called the guardian on the threshold, this is the kind of guardian on the threshold is more of the esoteric term, and the Bulwer-Lytton dweller on the threshold becomes what we know. So Steiner is saying, look, every student who gets to this level, you have to break through this, and he's aware of it. Now, this is the mystery school understanding. How does it relate to what the X factor taking place in the technology aspect when they're moving this through these different agencies later in a place called Pine Gap? How are they dealing with a subject like this? Well, is it possible in these experiments that they've encountered this pivotal point, the same place that the adept needs to face, the student needs to face to become an adept in these mystery schools, which is to face the dweller in the threshold? Well, there's all this imagery about a battle in the air and airships and all this kind of stuff around the air, which is the same type of imagery relating to the guardian, the dweller on the threshold. So another quick piece from Steiner on this, which is him referring to something called the White Lodge. Now, we know the Twin Peaks series used the White Lodge and the Black Lodge. And people may be familiar with those terms, but I don't think anyone will be too surprised after reading a little bit of Steiner to learn that David Lynch and Mark Frost are really into that. But here's a Steiner quote relating to the White Lodge and how this is going to interact with the student on his course. He says, you all know that the Earth is guided in a particular way by the so-called White Lodge, in which highly developed human individualities and individualities of a still higher kind, angels, archangels, etc., are combined. What do they do there? They work. They lead the evolution of the Earth. While leading this evolution, they are devising quite a specific plan. It is really the case that during the evolution of each planet, a specific plan is worked out by guiding powers. When the Earth is evolving plans for the atom, seed, or kernel for the evolution of Jupiter, which succeeds the Earth. So while the Earth is evolving, plans for the atom, seed, or kernel for the evolution of Jupiter, which succeeds the Earth, i.e. a future Jupiter in our next evolutionary stage, following the present Earth, are drawn up in the White Lodge to the Earth. The plan is worked out in full detail. Therein lies the blessing and salvation in progress. Among the faculty we must certainly carry with us is the knowledge that we are not here for our own sakes, but to carry out the divine cosmic plan. This is very heavy mysticism laid over here at this idea of the White Lodge. And this idea that part of the planetary evolution is wrapped up in these mystery schools is something we need to keep in mind, because planetary evolution is at the very heart of what we're talking about with the UFO file, because we're moving the technology up to a point where you can literally take something like the Earth and destroy it if you're not careful. That's why all these things play in with each other. And we're going to go further and figure out exactly how this happens. So it turns out that in Steiner's own life, he encountered a master along the way. Now, it's very interesting because Steiner was an incredible genius, and he had all these kind of early difficulties relating to other people. But a long story short, he meets this kind of strange older guy who's really good with plants. He's a gardener, and that guy is basically a messenger from these schools that Steiner's life is going to be influenced dramatically by it. So what's interesting about this is I often point out that these groups talk about a period 100 years from when they were operating, about 1916, of another chance to look at this work and another chance to move forward in this work. And so what he says, Steiner never identified the person, but they found out later who the actual gardener was, who had all these mystical abilities that basically initiated and was a messenger of Steiner from this mystery school. So his name, he was a Swabian herb gatherer by the name of Felix Kaguski. And there's a picture of him here. I don't have a larger picture of him, but maybe someday, just to give you an idea. And he basically acted like a very simple man, but he had incredible magic with flowers, and he could grow incredible plants and herbs. He was a total master of herbs. And he was later immortalized by Steiner in his 4 mystery plays. But so what he says is there's a clue hidden in the description of him being initiated into the secrets of plants and their effects and their connection with the cosmos and human nature. This is important, as you'll see below. So he talks a little bit about the identity of the master that he was introduced to by knowing this very unusual herbalist who obviously had some kind of magical, incredible psychic ability. And I want to point out again that the mystery schools and the political combination of the mystery schools, that is Bulwer Lytton sitting there with the prime minister, Richard Nixon sitting there with Jeane Dixon, this interface between political power and the incredible mystical abilities, and the fact that somebody like Emma Britton was pulled into the Orphic Circle because she had incredible abilities that they wanted to exploit for their ability to get this information on state secrets and use her as kind of a psychic channel. And the reason I call that like a modern day MyLab thing is because the way that they're treating her, they're not really letting her know what's going on, and they are preparing her in a certain way, but they're also monitoring her life because she can't have friends and she can't have a normal kid's life. So this gets very interesting. What Steiner says about this master, who he met when he was 12, and Steiner had a very unusual interaction with this spirit who, he saw this woman who kept asking for help, and then she would disappear into the stove. It's a really weird mystical vision that Steiner had, and it turned out when he talked to his parents about it, that it was a relative that died when he was about 3 years old. So his faculties were developing, and this master he meets right around this period of time. This gardener, Felix, who is a kind of a messenger for this mystery school and the master in that mystery school. So to sum up here, what Steiner says is, in considering the identity of the M, he doesn't call him master, he just refers to him as M, we must bear in mind this: the temptation for people to fanatically idealize a person bearing such authority is too great, which is the worst thing that can happen. They have to be very humble in these stations, because otherwise you get into ego attachment and you don't go anywhere dealing with it. It would be too much like idolatry. The silence, however, is essential if we wish not only to avoid the egoistic temptations of ambition and pride, which we could probably overcome, but above all to avoid the occult astral attacks that would be directed constantly at an individual of that level. That is why it is essential that a fact such as this not be mentioned until after 100 years. This 100-year thing comes up a lot, and I think it's interesting that the pocket and the period of time that it puts us in is this is the period. So obviously a lot of these things are coming to light now. Now, there's a lot of things there relating to Steiner and how he developed anthroposophy and these great abilities that he had, which were very much like Emma Britton. But the point is that they understand an essential function, which is that the mystery schools operate on a certain level and they kind of compete with each other to a certain degree, but they're always spotting out for advanced individuals and they are kind of casting nets wide. But in the heart of many of those mystery schools are political forces, and that can go either way, because very often if it's an idealized situation and you have political figures and factions that are working for real progress, then that's one kind of situation. But if they're working for something else and they're using these types of abilities to kind of carve the situation up, and using something like the X technologies to do it, if they're using this higher awareness of what this stuff was, then it's an incredibly dangerous situation. So interestingly enough, the Dweller on the Threshold is a kind of a large representation of what has to happen, which is you have to spiritually evolve in order to handle these things, or else you become, like Blavatsky said, sort of a plaything for these occult forces. And that's what can happen. You'll be either one or the other. Now, when we get into how this relates to A Wrinkle in Time, so I read to you that there was this whole thing relating to Bulwer Lytton in the title, which is It Was This Dark and Stormy Night, and about her background in dealing with spiritualism. But also the character that Oprah is playing is very much like the Dweller on the Threshold. They make her a little more benevolent in the movie. And in the movie, she keeps turning to the little girl and saying, you need to raise your frequency, you know. So they're kind of like a little Orphic circle using the psychic abilities of this girl. And what happens, and what I think is crucial about this, is, first of all, the character that disappears is working in an outfit like a Pine Gap type thing. It's a secret program dealing with a physicist who discovers a wrinkle in time and falls in. And this is what's happening when we talked about Prospero earlier. If you can keep all that Tempest lingo in mind about how he was in the cloven pine, Ariel was trapped in there, and the pine did make him gape and all these different things. And that's where we got Pine Gap when we were reading it. Well, some of the interaction that takes place in here relates directly, in fact, to the Tempest. In fact, she mentions the Tempest, Prospero, and Ariel being trapped, saying that, gee, this is exactly like my dad being trapped in this wrinkle in time, making the exact correlation to what exactly is going on here. And when we get to the end of what she says here, it's even more fascinating because it ties in all this stuff that we know relating to Pine Gap and how Prospero being the name of the military base that was supplying Pine Gap, and Prospero being the name of the satellite, the main satellite that Australia launched and got lost immediately. Then a lot of these other things are going to come together and make sense to us. So let's go back to that, because again, dealing with Shakespeare and that Francis Bacon and all the rest of it, we're dealing with the Rosicrucians and the mystery schools. That takes us to Bulwer Lytton. How are we doing over there, Olivia?
Doing great.
Fantastic. How are we doing on time? Okay, so I'm going to get in this part relating to A Wrinkle in Time, which, the movie, for all intents and purposes, may be good, may not be so good. But the important thing is read the book, because the book is fascinating. And the woman who put the book out has such an incredible grasp of the esoteric subjects And she's letting them out in little ways. And I think she's very advanced. So at a certain point, you know, the daughter is looking for her father, and there's this whole kind of group going along with her little brother, school friend, and all the rest of it. And so, and Mrs. Witch, who is the dweller on the threshold, in my opinion, it's Oprah's character, says to her, I'm sorry. Her glance shone out, and the rest of her appeared more slowly behind them. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, quoting directly. She smiled broadly. That's Prospero and the Tempest. I do like that play. And so Charles, the little brother, says, you didn't do it on purpose? And they go on here. And she says, oh, my darling, of course not. Mrs. Whatsit said quickly, it was just very understandable mistake. It's very difficult for Mrs. Witch to think in a corporeal way. She wouldn't hurt you deliberately, you know that. And it's really a very pleasant little planet and rather amusing. To be flat, we are always enjoying our visits there. So, you know, what's happening is she's using these kind of magical terms. They're starting to sneak in here. But she makes the direct reference to the Tempest. And this is what we need to keep our eye on. Remember what Steiner said in the beginning. He said, we need to learn to look in the right places. Prospero, in this case, is going to bring a lot of this information full circle. And she says, in Orion's belt, we have a friend there. This is where we're going to go. And we want you to have a look at your own planet. So she goes into this whole thing. And I won't belabor the point on that, but I'm going to go into this section. So now they're in a situation where they encounter someone called the Happy Medium, who, for my money, is a takeoff on Helena Blavatsky, because she's got the crystal ball and the scarf, and she's on a planet, she's doing all these things, and she says, oh, you need to overcome evil. You have to really kind of take on this evil thing in order to get your father back, and it's this dark force in the universe. So they're talking back and forth, and let's see if I can catch up with the conversation and get right to it. Oh, the thing is called It. Capital IT, though. That's the evil. And you must do as I have done and go into it, Charles said. No, and I can see you really don't want to save father. This is the daughter now talking. How will my being a zombie save my father? You'll just have to take my word for it, came the cold, flat voice. It wants you, and it will get you. Don't forget that I, too, am part of it now. And that's what happens. They take over the little brother. And so, you know, the sister becomes very worried, and the next time she encounters him, boom, it is inside of him operating. And he says, don't forget that I, too, am part of it now. You know, I wouldn't have done it if it weren't the right thing to do. Kelvin, Meg asked in agony, will it really save father? But Kelvin was paying no attention to her. He seemed to be concentrating with all his power on Charles Wallace, who's the little brother. He stared into the pale blue eyes, and that was all that was left of Charles Wallace's eyes. Quote, and for thou wast a spirit too delicate to act her earthly and abhorred commands, she did confine thee into a cloven pine. And there's the line again, directly from Prospero Shakespeare. Meg recognized Mrs. Who's words on him. For a moment, Charles Wallace seemed to listen. Then he shrugged and turned away. Calvin followed him, trying to keep his eyes focused on Charles. If you want a witch, Charles, he said, it's the witch, not Our Lady's. Good thing I had the Tempest at school this year, isn't it, Charles? It was the witch who put Ariel in the cloven pine, wasn't it? And they'll go back and forth talking about how this situation of her dad slipping into this, you know, strange wrinkle in time and the quantum mechanics behind it and how all this happened. But they're going to go back and forth talking about how this is exactly like Ariel and Prospero and that whole situation where Ariel needs to be rescued by Prospero out of the pine with Prospero's magic. And Ariel being a spirit of the air. And of course, right in the back here, it was a dark and stormy night. the linking up of the imagery that's going on here is simple. We have this physicist who falls into a gap, this wrinkle in time. We have the references to Pine Gap in Prospero, which was originally tied in with this naming the Pine Gap area from the Prospero base and supplying the Pine Gap base from the Prospero base, launching Prospero, the satellite that got lost in Australia. All of these things took place there in that period in the late 60s. And it seems to me, in studying what she's tapping into, and again, her being familiar with these and being an honorary member of some of these mystical orders, and her having this awareness of what is going on with the naming of Pine Gap. This book was written in 1962. So it's 5 years before the Pine Gap will become operational. But obviously, there's some reference in here to what's going on at Pine Gap. And what we feel is that when we get to this type of imagery, we're very close to discovering what Pine Gap's function is in the first place. Why are we even talking about this base? This base holds the UFO file, because what we have is the most incredibly secret base probably on the face of the earth, except that we actually know the name of it, but that couldn't be avoided because it had to be part of a high-profile deal. It's an unusual base. It's run strictly by the NSA. It's run strictly by the CIA. There's the whole thing about the Ultra Room being off limits to foreigners. It's only Americans that can get into it. We all know the X Keyscore story that came out from Edward Snowden's work. The X Steganography, the work of A Wrinkle in Time, Bulwer-Lytton, Prospero, Shakespeare. It's taking us into understanding that there's some kind of work dealing with an interdimensional aspect going on, that when you are working at the highest level with the UFO file, you've got to deal with this upper level. And the dweller on the threshold imagery that's being borrowed and put into A Wrinkle in Time comes directly out of the Steiner Bulwer-Lytton tradition. This is where the pendulum swings when we study the X Steganography. It doesn't take us into upper levels of understanding the technology. It takes us into deeper and deeper levels of understanding the esoteric framework, because apparently there's only so far that they can get redeveloping the technology on the same physical level that we're operating our normal technological advances on. They're working, and they've been in preparation for this, because of course some of these mystery schools go back many years, all the way back to Egyptian times. This Atlantean technology, the Atlantean airship stuff that's mentioned in Steiner's work, that's mentioned in Casey's work, that's mentioned in Theosophy and Anthroposophy, that's mentioned by Scott Elliott in his airship books. This whole aspect is a preparation for when that technology is back in our hands, and it's very extremely dangerous. So hence the reasons for the extreme secrecy around it. Now, let's go a little bit sideways to figure out how on this level do these kind of politicians get access to the types of figures that we've been discussing here. And we're going to go briefly into Jeane Dixon, and then we'll take your questions. In this book, The Scarlet Book of Freemasonry, which I think is loaded with details that are absolutely fascinating, and we're lucky that it was ever published in the first place. In Chapter X, let's see if you can see that. Yes, it's Chapter X, the recent remarkable discovery of Masonic emblems in Egypt. And there's this whole effort in this early pictures of Cleopatra's Needle, and how there's an exact replica of it in London and one was taken here. And the whole process of it getting taken here is absolutely fascinating, and I'm going to condense it. But here we go. Basically, the obelisks were given by the Egyptian rulers to the French, who gave it to these people in the UK, and they had to figure out how to make them travel all the way over here. One of the things that's important is that a figure pops up who handled the whole process, and his name is John Dixon. And you might see where this story is going to go here very shortly. All right, so let's get into Dixon, John Dixon, engineer. And a quick check on Olivia. Now's the time to ask Olivia.
The questions are coming in.
Okay.
I actually have too many already.
You got too many. Okay.
Know.
Well, last night you didn't have enough. You said. That's good. That's very good. Again, you're here with Dark Journalist, and it's great to have everyone out here. Friday nights at 7 p.m. is when you can usually catch us. We started a little late tonight, but we had a lot of stuff to share with you. It's great to have everyone here, and one of the things I think that we know for sure is that this is a very pivotal X episode. So if you did make it here, it's good timing. So John Dixon was an English railway civil engineer and was the Stockton and Darlington's Railways chief civil engineer between 1842 and 1865. Here's something exciting. Dixon started work as a bank clerk and assisted George and Robert Stevenson to survey the Stockton-Darlington Railway. So he worked in this railway, and he got all these talents by doing it. He became a civil engineer, and he was the man who was responsible for taking this incredible obelisk from France to London, ultimately to New York City. And of course, it came from Egypt in the first place. It has nothing to do with Cleopatra, even though it's called Cleopatra's Needle. As a matter of fact, it's a couple of thousand years earlier than that. It's an absolutely magical device, in a sense. And they really needed it over here to form this kind of... there's 4 of them in the grand scheme of things. And I'll go deeper into that at some point. John Dixon was the great-nephew of Jeremiah Dixon, who with Charles Mason set the famous Mason-Dixon line. And if you know that in America, the Mason-Dixon line separates the country there. Now, what's fascinating about this is John Dixon, responsible for transporting Cleopatra's Needle to England, was the nephew of this man. He was born on January 2nd, 1835, and died in 1891. So Dixon, the Dixons are very deep into the early Masonic building aspects, and they are located in the UK, and they come over here. And they're located in this particular part of the UK. And so that whole clan is highly related to each other. As a matter of fact, in some of the cases, going back in time with Jeane Dixon's husband, I found that his relatives were actually from the same street as these Dixons. And this is where the correlations come up. But a quick look at Jeremiah Dixon, just briefly. Jeremiah Dixon was an English surveyor and astronomer, best known for his work with Charles Mason in determining what was later called the Mason-Dixon line. He served as assistant to Charles Mason in 1761 when the Royal Society selected Mason to observe the transit of Venus from Sumatra. However, their passage to Sumatra was delayed, and they landed instead at Cape of Good Hope, where the transit was observed on June 6, 1761. Dixon returned to the Cape once again to work on experiments with gravity. Okay, so this Jeremiah Dixon, all of these people are distantly related to Jeane Dixon's husband, and this is what we've turned up, which is absolutely fascinating. There's so many things I could say to you about Jeremiah Dixon, how unusual his work is putting together this, but the key thing I want us all to key in on is that he's an astronomer. This is his fundamental function. Okay, let's get a little bit closer. There's something here called the Stargazers Zone. Let's take a look at this. I don't have a big picture of it, but you get the idea. Stargazers Zone Stone is located in Stargazers Farm near Embryville, Pennsylvania. It marks the site of a temporary observatory established by Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon, which they used in their survey for the Mason-Dixon line, so that they were able to do this. The stone was placed by Mason and Dixon north of the Harlan House. Moving down. The observatory was the final step in the resolution of a border dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland that lasted 80 years. From 1730 to 1738, a violent border conflict known as Cresap's War was fought between Pennsylvania and Maryland. I've never heard of that war, but in any case, something very unusual was going on there when they erected this. He's a master astronomer. and his family becomes master masons. They're the ones who bring over this incredible obelisk. Now, one quick thing from the book mentioning what they did exactly to get the obelisk here. And again, that's in Chapter X, just like Knowledge of Higher Worlds was in Chapter X earlier. Basically, what happens is it's early October 1877. The first practical steps are taken toward bringing to New York this great historic obelisk of Alexandria. Mr. John Dixon of London was then transporting to London the prostrate obelisk of Alexandria, which now stands in the new Thames embankment in that city. So they erected one in London, and then they're bringing the other one over. And what they do, there's incredible money involved in transporting it and the security around it and all the rest of it. But a long story short, they have a Masonic ceremony when they place it in Central Park, and they put together a massive time capsule that they put into the base of Cleopatra's Needle that's standing there as we speak. So you've got Jeane Dixon's ancestors here operating in astronomy. No, Jeane Dixon's husband's ancestors. They're not directly related, but her husband. Okay, so we understand that they bring this obelisk over, and we understand that they set it up and that they're master astronomers and masons, and that they put a time capsule in the base of it. You might see where this is going. Okay, next up. And Cleopatra's Needle, the story around it, it's all very unusual as to why we needed it so badly and why it was so crucial to have the exact match to the one in London, whereas Paris had to be the exact match to the one that was still in Egypt. So there's definitely unusual aspects going on there. There's an actual account here of what the time capsule was all about when they placed it in, and the ceremony that they did with it, secret ceremony, placing it there. So the hieroglyphs that accompany the main portion of the obelisk translate the good God given life. And we get this kind of importance that they were laying on it. And I think the astronomical tie-in is crucial, because what we get when we look at Jeane Dixon's life, which I've been studying pretty hardcore and coming up with some interesting anecdotes, what I think really relate to the research that we're doing. Of course, right in Newsweek, they've got Nixon and Dixon. Everyone understands, strangely enough, although other people understood this, it took a 9/11 investigator, someone who's looking into the history of dealing with terrorism, to figure out that Jeane Dixon was giving high-level advice to President Nixon in the 70s, and that he was taking her advice in everything from nuclear deals to the Vietnam War, to dealing with protesters, to dealing with the Russians. I mean, I've stated it on this program over and over again, she was clearly the most powerful woman from in the world for a period of time, certainly for her era. Who else that you can think of had decisions, who was a woman that had that kind of an impact on a massive scale? Here she is influencing the president of the United States, but not just one. Of course, we know that she influenced FDR. The question I had was, how did she get into those circles? And of course, it's through her husband, who she actually met when she was 12, which I found interestingly enough. And he, supposedly being some friend of the family, and there's nothing untoward in their relationship except she had a huge crush on him, and he went and got married, and she was a broken-hearted teenager. But there's something interesting to me about looking at Jeane Dixon's life, because it seems to me that she was in a similar situation as Emma Britton, where they had spotted out her talent long in advance, and they were planning on using it and grooming her to do this, because eventually she gets to be 19 and she falls in love with this Dixon character, James Dixon. And what he does, he's about 30 years her senior, but they get married, and he's divorced, which is also very tricky in that period for this to happen. And he's the one who brings her to DC, because that's where he lives. And let's remember, the other Dixons, they also lived in DC. So he brings her into these circles, and she does this incredible thing with the crystal ball, and she's reading for all these people. And the idea is that, her fame spread and the FDR wanted to talk to her. I don't think it worked that way. I think that these Masons worked in certain circles, and they had spotted out someone, just like the Orphic Circle did, when they were very young, and they developed their talent and moved them along and said, at a certain point, you're ready to help the president out with these decisions. This is how those mystery schools work and how the talent gets developed. But let's think about Dixon for a minute, because she had all this incredible impact on Nixon. There's something called Nixon's Pyramid here, which I believe she had an incredible impact on, but it's an anti-ballistic missile station that's built like a pyramid. We're also going to get a quick look here at James Lamb Dixon, her husband. It's one of the only pictures I could find. He's on the top, and he's older at that point. And interestingly enough, they're talking about he's going over there at the Watergate. He's going to give a speech. And and there's a shot, by the way, of Cleopatra's Needle. So what we're getting is that James Dixon is who brings her into this corridor of dealing with political power. That's how it works. James Dixon's partner was Hal Roach, who was the movie producer. They're living in the high life in Los Angeles, her and her husband, and they go to DC, and they are, living it up with FDR and all these other people. And FDR takes her in, and she gives him a series of readings. Now, remember, one of the things I pointed out about Emma Hardinge is that, or Emma Britton, Hardinge Britton, is that she gives all these incredible readings to Abraham Lincoln. Although it's largely known that Abraham Lincoln saw these other mediums, it's largely rumored that the main person that he went to was Emma, and she went around the country giving speeches for Lincoln, not as a medium, but as a political activist. So this tradition of the mystery schools using the kind of incredibly talented psychically people. Remember Edgar Casey being taken to the White House to draw up the incredible 14 points for Woodrow Wilson. That's also something that came out. So we understand on this level they're using those psychic abilities. And of course, Reagan got into all this trouble because he was dealing with astrology, and that they had Jeane Dixon at the house so many times. She was at the Nixon either on the phone or visiting his White House over 70 times. So I believe that Dixon had the impact on, it's why this kind of comes around to the time capsule idea, because that family tradition of laying the time capsule at the base of Cleopatra's Needle seems to me something that comes back if we consider Nixon's close relationship to Dixon. And if we go a little further and we remember this letter about Nixon predicting that Trump is going to be president, that's clearly a Jeane Dixon prediction, because, he's just coming out of the blue and saying the word predict. Well, who's his close friend that does predictions? It's Jeane Dixon. And so that's where I think we get the next step in looking at the X. But so when we take characters like Steiner talking about Bulwer-Lytton and how Bulwer-Lytton is surrounded by these prime ministers or future prime ministers in England, and how Emma Britton was one of their main somnambulist channels that they were using to get this higher information, these people are very aware of these tools, and it relates very strongly to the X Steganography. And when we go into the next episode, it's going to be a continuation of this line, because now we're bringing together the esoteric with the high tech. So with that, now I'm going to turn it over to Olivia and your questions.
Okay, I'm going to give the first comment to Josh Randall, who says, "My brain is ash."
That's good.
So much to keep up with.
That's great. It's great to have you out there, Josh.
Okay, so Boomer Fighter, I just wanted to throw this in, says the national feng shui was ruined by the surveying of the Mason-Dixon line. They cut down all the trees to have sight lines. And obviously that includes the ley lines. Fascinating.
Wow. Excellent point. Yeah, I can see we're going to get pretty far on the Mason-Dixon connection. It's going to go far. And what I was reading in the Mason book really was, I was saying to myself, why are they taking this incredible effort to get this obelisk over here? There's something really significant in that. So I see Najat is out there. Hello, Najat.
Yeah, Najat has some fantastic questions. So let's just go right into it.
Okay.
So she asks, how deep does this rabbit hole go? I feel like whatever is out there is only playing with humanity like a game. And is the solution to defeating dark/demon entities hidden in the same esoteric lore?
Yeah, well, clearly that's the message of A Wrinkle in Time, interestingly enough, which is you have to raise your frequency in order to combat this. What is it that Steiner's saying? We need to learn to look in the right places. Well, obviously there are answers. And I think these people have left the information, but they can't force it on you. You have to be able to come to it and accept it and puzzle it out. In terms of how deep does the rabbit hole go? I don't think that in our lifetimes we discover just how deep that rabbit hole goes, but I think we can get a handle on certain aspects of it so that we're not completely in the dark. Put it to you that way. Okay.
Catherine Woodman
yes.
asked a question that's close to my heart.
Okay.
So if knowledge is power and this information is entertaining to enter within and interesting to hold one's interest, then why do I feel so powerless?
Wow. Well, I can only relate my own kind of feelings about this thing, but when I discover things, I feel like I have more momentum towards answers. And I feel like when I give out that information that you have more momentum, just like when Steiner gave his information out, so many people got so much more momentum, and that we get that momentum, and now we're building up some momentum. So I believe these things are about momentum, and I think that there's a kind of a hypnosis of life that can take over, and we have to be grateful that we're able to get our eyes up above that type of situation and deal with some of these deeper core realities. Now, it can be overwhelming, just like when people sit there and they say, well, the dollar is going to crash, and you need to invest in gold, and you need to get Bitcoin, and you need to buy a bunker and all this stuff, and it's all a bunch of noise. And really, you look at it in the end and you say, it's a bunch of people selling stuff. So, there might be some truths in it, but there's much better way to get at information. And I think that we're kind of overly marketed. But if we can kind of hold our center and take the information in and kind of screen out what's not good, like Olivia did with the trolls tonight. And like, we're so used to that. That's probably the best approach. I don't think it's supposed to be easy, but I don't think it's supposed to be so overwhelming that you can't do it. Gurdjieff said there's a quote, actually Bennett said there's a quote from Gurdjieff, which is something like, mankind's or humanity's position is very difficult, but it's not without rewards. And that's why you see that allusion in the Bible all the time about wearing a crown, going through these things and having a crown at the end of it. This is very esoteric language. So yeah, I think there's answers.
Bruce Wayne asks, who wants the UFO file to be kept secret the most, human or ET?
That's a great point. I'd say regular humans don't want that. Regular people would like to know about this. And I think it's the Catherine Austin Fitts thing where, she goes back to Winston Churchill, and people said, well, he was talking about Hitler in the 30s, and JFK wrote a book called Why England Slept. Why didn't people do something about what Hitler was doing when he marched into the Rhine and all the rest of it and broke all the rules of the treaty? And the reason was because their illusion was comfortable. And so, we get into these situations where it's important, very often people will say things like, you ever hear these people come on and say, and speaking about political matters, and they say, wake up, but they're not awake because they're a lunatic screaming and they're just about to pop a blood vessel from their blood pressure. So that's not real waking up. We need to learn that when things are said, it takes both what's said and the kind of energetic impact of it together, which is why we see so much, guru style people walking around saying you need to achieve enlightenment and have discernment. It doesn't mean anything because we know in their lives they don't do any of that. So we need to understand, I think, and focus in on the importance of the ideas that get presented, that we absorb them and hold that kind of energy in the conversations when we talk about these things, then the energy changes, I think, around all of it. I don't know. Does that answer it good?
Yeah, sure. Artie Limos, thoughts on the connection between Pine Gap and the 1966 Westall UFO incident?
I think they're related. I definitely think they're related. The Westall incident, of course, a whole school saw these crafts, and some of them came down and sort of reloaded or whatever. And it looked like the U.S. government showed up immediately. No one recognized the uniforms, which is very unusual. So they had some outfit there. So yes, the incredible cases of Australian UFOs and Pine Gap are definitely related. And I feel like we're going to learn that the off-world presence, you know, they would have a great interest in studying what we were doing there. But a lot of what people are seeing are probably things that are being redeveloped there at Pine Gap. No doubt about it. Okay, you're up.
I just wanted to throw this out. Pat Cook said something really interesting. Gurdjieff or Ouspensky said about freedom from reincarnation, quote, all cannot escape. There are many laws against it. It would cause an immediate response from mechanical forces.
Yeah, well, they don't include reincarnation in the fourth way system. So he's not talking about reincarnation. They might be, Ouspensky talks about recurrence a lot. But I think they're just talking about advancing, period. Evolving. And, you know, all of those schools, like the mystery schools, take reincarnation on. For some reason, the fourth way went off into this different direction. And they were like, there were problems with the spiritualist movement. There were problems with anthroposophy. What were they doing? And they were bringing up spiritual matters, you know, of a kind of cosmic level, talking with masters and talking about reincarnation. And the fourth way goes into this whole different direction that you need to deal with yourself and your self-remembering. And you need to concentrate on your tasks and not float away into fantasies. So it is pretty fascinating, though, because I do believe that we are under certain definite laws, and not just scientific ones, but there's a series of laws relating to the etheric thing. And, you know, Olivia, you and I were talking about this. Corporations take advantage of the knowledge of these occult laws, because when they say, we're here to serve you, and service is an esoteric law, it's a tradition in these schools that you need to serve somebody. That master that I referred to earlier, who awakened Steiner at an early age, he was a simple gardener. He was doing gardening for people. You know, he wasn't Jeff Bezos, or, you know, he wasn't trying to be a Mac Daddy or something. He was really living a humble life. But they understand this service protocol, and these corporations and this ruling class that sit around at Davos. Trust me, they understand what we're talking about to the nth level. And so, but I do find that interesting, because we were picking up on a number of different laws that are exercised.
That's the other thing, is that cults work that way too. They take the truth, they take those principles, and they twist them. Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, 100%. And we see a lot of that right here in 2018. Let's face it. Okay. What else you got?
Giovanni Delgado was talking about Smedley Butler, and did you comment on that?
Smedley Butler, he wrote War is a Racket. There was a whole coup that was about to take place against FDR, these fascist forces. And I do know that later that FDR suspected that Prescott Bush was involved, but he was never able to prove it. They were a group of Wall Street bankers, and that happened in 1935. And they asked Smedley Butler to be the stand-in character, because fascism was sweeping everywhere. You know, Hitler had taken over, Mussolini. It was like, hey, let's have our own fascist in the U.S. And these guys were dead serious, though. And the conditions were pretty bad right after the Depression, and they thought, this is our opportunity to move in. And the entire coup was disbanded, and FDR, being smart like he was about these types of things, he didn't go for any public prosecutions. He didn't want to give the next guy the idea to do this or try this. So they very quietly prosecuted some of these people. But Smedley Butler was the general that they went to, and he said, no way. You know, I believe in the Constitution. So he sent those Wall Street guys packing. But it is a very unusual chapter there in history. Okay, what else?
Titan-blooded, is Pine Gap part of the Echelon Project?
Oh, yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I think that the main channel starts, Echelon is the home, Pine Gap is the home of Echelon, and that spreads out across the entire world. But that's the main, remember, Pine Gap is so secret because it is the main listening station for all of these spy activities. So that's what we're talking about here. That's the heart of it. And I've found in my own research relating to the X Steganography, everything is pointing towards Pine Gap. And when I went through Dornberger's work and Blue Gemini and all these different types of things, really, although they were doing different types of industrial style work here, it seemed to me the most secret place, the most secret research, the actual UFO file was being worked on at Pine Gap. That's what all the kerfuffle was about with the Queen and Gough Whitlam. That's what this whole thing is about, relating to A Wrinkle in Time, and the whole thing about Prospero and Prospero the satellite. They've used this place for multi-purposes. Certainly it's a listening station, and the NSA are deeply involved in listening around the world. But what they have there is a redevelopment, a recreation, experimental station. And remember that Nixon, according to information that was coming out, was about to announce that Pine Gap had solved the energy crisis in 1975. That was probably related to the X technology. Okay.
C.C. Jarvis has a great quote here.
Oh, yeah.
Fascism in history is like this axiom. What's the difference between a rat and a squirrel? Good PR. I just wanted to share that because I liked it.
He's got the right idea.
So is there, Chio Marley, is there anything to the rumors of a Stargate at Pine Gap?
Yeah, well, a lot of the things we're getting to with X, and what we talked about with the very early Plato's Cosmic X, that's all Stargate stuff. It's that there's a certain point in time when that Stargate opens. They're aware of that. Now, those people studying the Eleusinian mysteries, remember, whenever we're talking high tech, we're talking mystery school knowledge, if they're going to utilize it. So they study those things. That's why there's a remote viewing program. That's why in Emma Britton's story from the 19th century, the Orphic Circle was using her, and it was future prime ministers and Bulwer Lytton, who was a politician after all. So there's no question about it. They have to be looking at what that's all about. And of course, a lot of that goes back to ancient Egypt and a lot of the descriptions of it. I think it's an important area of study. Absolutely.
Suhaib Sufi, is Woomera linked to Pine Gap?
Yes. And Woomera is where they launched the Prospero satellite. So you're right at the heart. I mean, it's related to Pine Gap. It's the range is not in Pine Gap. It's not near it. But it's a major center. And I actually have a picture of Woomera amongst my souvenirs here tonight. But it is, yeah, it's definitely hardcore. And what I found is there's incredible X steganography in that Woomera base. And I will bring that out. I have not brought that one out yet. But the X steganography relating to how they describe the base is also quite fascinating. So yes, that base is absolutely crucial.
Heather Polly, could the Stargate be related to the unusual use of the Ultra Room?
Well, yeah, absolutely. We don't know much about this Ultra Room. And the fact that they won't let anybody else in tells us that it's something that isn't covered by a typical high security agreement. It can't be like, we'll threaten you or we'll court-martial you. It has to be something where they can only have people they trust, and they only trust Americans, which is amazing because it's a base on Australia's soil. Australia, by the way, there's going to be a new series called Pine Gap on Netflix. They just announced, in combination with Netflix Australia. By the way, A Wrinkle in Time was developed by Walt Disney, Disney Australia, and all the distribution goes through Australia. So Australia is just showing up as this hardcore thing. And of course, they shoot a lot of A Wrinkle in Time in Australia and New Zealand. So yes, Australia is really positioned right now to be this incredible position. And, you know, I'll tell you that a lot of the North Korean, South Korean peace deal that's going on right now, everyone's very happy to see that and the possible lessening of nuclear tensions. But I guarantee you that the proximity of Pine Gap to North Korea, with the kind of advanced and exotic technologies that are in operation at Pine Gap, probably play a lot into that deal in the grand scheme of things, because I think we've gotten pretty powerful.
Key Largo asks a great question. The MK Ultra room, perhaps the children of the employees are being put through MK Ultra training. Absolutely.
And, you know, that's really a good point. And there's so many things about this, because when they cast a web out, like we're talking about, they really do. We understand very often, related to MK Ultra and things like that, that the families of the people are often pulled in as kind of a wedge issue and something that they might be able to manipulate the main person with. They might even build allegiances with the family, but the family may also voluntarily give up some of their kids to do this because they want them to be highly valued in this program. I'm absolutely convinced that the programs that Emma Britton discussed from the 19th century not only continued on, but became far more advanced. And I'm sure when we get into complex understandings in esoteric terms about things like the dweller on the threshold, those programs, the X technologies and the UFO file, at some point demand a very high order of esoteric mystery school style knowledge. So yeah, that's a great suggestion. It's quite possible.
Cassandra Helwig, does DJ believe in a modern MyLab program? If so, what are they being used for?
Well, MyLabs have always been interesting. Melinda Leslie's work gives us an idea of what that program is about. And there have been some people who've come forward. One of them was a researcher who died in the 90s, and she did remarkable work around this. But the idea is that you have some kind of an encounter, like we've seen people have encounters with UFOs and contacts, a Betty Barney Hill style encounter, contact. And then you get tracked by the military because they want to know what kind of effect and what kind of tracking goes on between the abductee and the people who have abducted her, the aliens that have done that. So what happens, and I think it's pretty fascinating, is they reenact. And they'll actually take someone in and do their own version of an abduction to find out the psychological structure of this person, try to reenact the experience, whatever it happens to be. And they also can test out some of the recovered, re-engineered technology by doing this. They might have certain types of devices, certain types of medical procedures that they've gained from doing that. So it is quite fascinating. When I was saying MyLab in relation to Emma Britton, it's sort of a mix of the MyLab, MK Ultra. You know, it is along the lines of some of the things that Kathy O'Brien talked about, where they just kind of made her submit. And she, you know, she learned to develop these different personalities and the DID disorder and all these different things. And I think that's a way, on the real negative side, how that gets used. I think with Emma Britton, what they were doing was something similar, but they weren't interested in abusing her. That's not the impression that I get, but they wanted to dominate her psychic life, and they wanted that product that came out of it. And let's remember, when you're talking about Pine Gap, the merino sheep, that whole thing, that whole imagery, and why the NSA calls them sheep, is very something to consider, because they're getting the wool from the sheep, right? It's on the most simple level that they're operating this metaphor. And this is the type of thing I think we need to look for. But yeah, I think these psychic programs are operated on young people. And I don't think that all of the things that we talk about where children are in these programs is all about, you know, a lot of people will point out pedophilia and sex gangs and political groups and human trafficking. And certainly we've seen that that's part of the political scene. But I don't think that all of that activity relates to that. I think some of it is about finding these very advanced, special, gifted psychic children.
And gummy bears again. Have either of you seen an alien?
Isn't that interesting? Well, not lately.
You met an angel.
Oh, it's true. True. That's very interesting. But he did say alien after all. No, and I think it's interesting too when we hear about these incidents, and I like to talk about Ingo Swann's story, that what he realized about aliens, the very incredibly human-looking kind who are supposed to be stunning and all the rest, is that they're incredibly telepathic. And that seems to be the key, because when Timothy Good discussed the similar type of thing, that was his observation as well. So if you run into a situation where you feel like someone's incredibly telepathic, you might be dealing with an off-world visitor. It's certainly possible.
Is there anything new on the Nixon time capsule, and how is Robert Merritt?
Merritt is managing his illness, and we spoke maybe about a week ago, and he has told me some interesting things, and I feel like the original effort, which happened February 14th when Merritt came on the show, and the letter to the National Archives, the archivist, by the way, same archivist who made the recommendation because of the CIA, supposedly made the recommendation to Trump, that was in the memorandum. This is the same guy. He's the archivist. So, but they ignored that original letter, and then there was some idea, some talk about reaching directly to the Trump White House in relation to this. But I feel like with managing Merritt's illness and all the rest of it, some of it rests on the fact that we've put the material out, and that the material may be reaching the right people in relation to this. So there will be updates on Robert Merritt and the time capsule in the future. I think we got a blast of the time capsule and where it may have come from, understanding that Dixon's husband and his relatives placed this time capsule in the base of Cleopatra's Needle. It gives us a little bit of a tradition there that might be going on among these Mason families, and that certainly includes the advice that Nixon would get about the time capsule. But remember, Eisenhower had the X time capsule, Project X, which is a 100-year time capsule to be opened in 2053. Okay, that time capsule was already X, and the first item in that time capsule is Richard Nixon. That much we know. So that's very odd. So certainly this is where Nixon got some of the impulse to do it. But I think Dixon's story and her background and her family placing this time capsule in Cleopatra's Needle may be a continuation of that.
Philip Gillenwater wants to know, is he willing to give more specifics about what is in the letter?
He's given incredible specifics about what's in the letter. I think the question always was, will he reveal the location publicly? You know, but the specifics being that, remember, Merritt's not a person who was big on the UFO front. He wasn't interested in the subject. So when Nixon's telling him this stuff, it's very unusual. And we've kind of determined that he was doing it to create a record, to create a kind of human time capsule in addition to the actual document. And I do feel like the document would contain what he's talking about, which is this formula for energy independence for America, one, and two, a complete description of our work with the off-world presence and the reengineering of off-world craft. That seems to be the crux of the Nixon time capsule story.
Okay. Heather Polly wanted to follow up on the Stargate question.
Okay.
Saying, what is DJ's opinion on how far the Stargate tech has been developed?
Oh, that's very, very interesting. Well, remember, it's a lot about observation, which is how much do you know? That's important. In the Eleusinian Mysteries, you have them traveling towards Plato's Cross, which is some of the work from George Latour that I introduced in this show with Joseph Farrell in part 7. Those cultures understood it, and some of the adepts from that period certainly understood those stargates. This culture seems to want to apprehend everything and use it as a tool or a weapon and all the rest of it. So they might understand it from those perspectives, but I don't think they understand the deeper implications of what it can do at all. That would be my guess.
Terry Tolkien, who is the one that toured with Bauhaus.
Oh, hey.
Hey.
Fantastic. That's got to be a book in itself. I'd love to see that.
Is Pine Gap connected with Mount Zeal in Australia's north, long cited by government remote viewers as one of the 4 permanent alien bases on Earth?
Isn't that fascinating? There have been these people who've looked for that. Pat Price was one of them, who passed away shortly after he was doing this investigation of where the bases are. And one of the things I want to point out, actually, is that in the book by Madeleine L'engle, A Wrinkle in Time, the force that she's dealing with on these planets that they're trying to kind of get around is called central intelligence. So does that give you kind of a little heads up on the magic aspects and who you're trying to avoid when you get into those situations? So going back to your Stargate question. But yeah, I think in terms of different locations in Australia seems to be quite a magnet for UFO activity. And it's an ideal location, I would say, for an off-world base. It could be part of the reason why Pine Gap was chosen in the first place. Absolutely. Okay, we'll take a couple more questions.
Okay, wasn't Saddam Hussein in possession of a Stargate factory in Gulf War?
Well, this is very interesting because I did an episode with Dr. Joseph Farrell, and we talked extensively about his theories that I called archaeology wars, which is, as part of the interaction, we might be after more than just oil. We might be looking for some of these sacred relics and some of that ancient technology during the Sumerian times that was banned, as it were, as he pointed out in his book, and was buried. That's the only way it's presented. But let's think about the Edgar Cayce Hall of Records at the Atlanteans' place. In the Hall of Records, there's supposed to be information about the Two-Eye Crystal. The Two-Eye Crystal is something that at one point in history ran the entire world. And I always mention this, that Cayce's version of Atlantis is so cutting edge, and it's not about, a Grecian style civilization, which is, certainly advanced enough. But his version of society is something that's more advanced than this one. They have craft that can go through mountains and things like that. And they're dealing with off-world visitors. So it's an incredibly advanced vision. And where's Cayce getting this in 1919? You could say that Theosophy and Anthroposophy framed the question, but Cayce really took it to an entirely different level. So there is that information out there. I think there's a lot in that. And the Hall of Records idea being under the paw of the Sphinx, it's the ultimate stealth archive, right? It's something that we know is out there that relates to this. And there were all these political haggling and all these people who were originally set up by the Edgar Cayce Foundation, who became part of the establishment and kind of disowned the Cayce Foundation, or in some cases, like Zahi Hawass, continued to be funded for research. Because the Cayce people, I think they were taken advantage of. There's this guy out there who says, yeah, sure, I'll find Atlantis for you. But he's just scooping up the money and the prestige. And probably with the government, they were looking for the Hall of Records for a totally different reason than the Cayce people were. They wanted the power that it would give them. And, so I think that that's a lot of what was going on in this. But this reference to a secret stash of information, a sacred relic, there's something back there. It's a cultural memory that something was hidden that related to a very advanced kind of a thing, very much like the Ark of the Covenant style story.
Scruples 4444. What is DJ's take on the alleged removal of alien tech/artifacts from the Baghdad Museum immediately after troops entered the city during the Iraq War?
This is it. That's a big piece of it right there. And what's interesting is a lot of people said, wait a minute, they're wearing American uniforms going in there and scooping the stuff, but the people didn't look American. Now that's a pretty interesting judgment call, but let's take it a little bit further. Were these people dressed up who knew that this was going to happen, and they would dress up as Americans and go in there? And one of the things that's pointed out by Farrell again in relation to the Baghdad Museum kerfuffle and the Gulf War is, you know, there were this whole with the Iraq War just beforehand, there were Germans working and doing really amazing advanced archaeology and getting, because Iraq is really right in the heart of the ancient history story. It's pre-biblical. And, you know, so where we start the story off and stuff, all those early lands, it's pre-Israel. And it's kind of like this whole world of information and things that we would understand, the Sumerian civilization, Mesopotamia, Assyria, that's all in that region. So those discoveries there, we have a very quaint idea about our history right now. We frankly don't know a great deal about it. Graham Hancock says we're a species with amnesia. Well, it's probably because we're still using an 18th century version of Egyptology, you know, those ridiculous charts. I'll tell you what, let's put a few lasers and satellites over places like Egypt and find out where all the ruins are and then start digging the stuff up. You know, that's what we can do. And I'm sure there are groups that are doing that. But, you know, this stuff that we're working with, you know, like they built the pyramids with pulleys and stuff and slaves. And then they talk about, oh yeah, you know, this pharaoh had a bunch of slaves with them. And that's as far as their thinking goes. You know, it's a much more advanced civilization working with the memory, you know, we've all seen that incredible tile of the airship and the tank. You know, these people had those technologies. And certainly I think after Atlantis, the higher levels, classes kept them hidden and kept them among themselves. But we've also seen evidence that they've used electricity and so on. So yeah, much more high-tech situation back there than we realize. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions.
Giovanni Delgado, has DJ heard Russia has classified Tesla Tech 2?
You know, it does come up, but I don't think that... I think that they have their own Teslas. I'll put it to you that way. And I think that obviously the FBI got their hands on Tesla stuff, but I think Tesla was also clever enough to hide some of his information. And as a result, I think someone like John Trump, who they sent in, who was Trump's uncle, and we did that whole thing about Trump, Tesla, and the Time Capsule, which is an excellent episode. I think that brings a lot of these facts together if you want to watch it. We have to remember with Tesla that he's somebody who really poured it all out there because he wanted the free wireless energy for everyone. And he wanted wireless energy the way we have wireless cell phones now. And the forces that were involved, like JP Morgan and some of these people around him, even Westinghouse, I mean, Westinghouse was better than some of these guys, but really they couldn't handle it because they couldn't figure out if this guy makes energy free, we won't make a profit, it'll destroy our position and all the rest of it. So they really suppressed the work that he had. But I do feel that being who he was, he very well could have vouchsafed some information that's not in the public eye.
Okay, JJK, I would love to know where DJ was able to get the Freemason book. Fascinating stuff. I've been to my local library, and they look at me like I'm crazy when I ask for those types of books. Well, you don't even know where you got that one, do you?
I'm trying to think. Certainly not at the library. No, it was in a book. It may have been in a church actually, and which had a lot of old books that they were selling, and I think that's where it came up. And the first thing I noticed about it, like I just noticed about it a couple of days ago when I reopened it, is that it incredibly the dust grabs your throat immediately. But it's certainly worth it. But yeah, it's an incredible book, and I think there are versions of it with later editions out there, and I would read it just because I think it's a good, solid overview of what real Masonic history is about.
JJK also had a great question. Is the linking of literature and philosophies and secret schools clues for mere mortals or exclusion?
No, this is a good point. You do, when you're getting into mystery schools, there's always like the Renaissance painters are always associated with mystery schools. You know, politicians are very often associated with mystery schools. There's a series of different types of mystery schools, some lesser, some higher, and all the rest of it. So, and some good and some not so good. But the idea that knowledge was passed down through these groups of an advanced nature, and take the Pythagoras schools, for example, you know, it's a recapturing of it. So when we get into things like Theosophy and Gurdjieff and the Fourth Way and Anthroposophy, they're like modern mystery schools. They're presenting this information and they're putting it out there for us. And it's kind of like taking a chance. But as I've described, there was a decision deep in those schools at a certain point. Some of them decided we need to put this out as a buffer against scientific materialism. I don't think they're trying to exclude people, but I do think there's kind of like there's a worthiness aspect involved with those schools, which is like anything, you know, in order to get a reward in life, you need to put your best effort forward. So in dealing with schools and dealing with that idea of advanced mystery schools giving out information, I do feel like there is a selection process that takes place. They have a way of scanning those things out, and that, you know, hopefully, I think in the grand scheme of things, they give it out to humanity and the whole of humanity advances. That's the hope. But not everyone is probably willing to do it. Some people are very happy with the kind of commercial, you know, over the top kind of hyper 21st century lifestyle that we've seen, and it's not so promising. I think for people like that, I don't think they're going to get it because they don't want it. So yes, the first rule I think would be you have to want it in dealing with that. But I don't think that they exclude people on purpose. I think it would be a situation where you'd have to work for it. So if you're willing to work for it, in Gurdjieff's mind, he said the biggest problem I have is that the students who come in and think roast pheasant is going to fly into their mouths, meaning that they're going to get this incredible dinner placed before them with no effort on their part. And the whole thing is about work. So that's a spiritual principle. And I think it's a good place to put on it. Now, to tie all this together, when we look at, you know, some of the things that we've talked about in the people like Emma Britton and Rudolf Steiner tonight, and the whole connection with Prospero and Madeleine L'engle, these were people who were really following their Tao in a way. They really were following the direction in their lives, and there was a kind of a magical chemistry that was going on because they were doing that. This book was offered up 26 times, and all of these different publishers totally were like, this thing is crazy. We're not going to put that out. Are you kidding? For kids? And what happened accidentally when she had given up on it is her mother knew a different type of book publisher who she wasn't even planning on pitching him the book. He just happened to be at some sort of a dinner party, and they talked about it. And he was like, actually, I've never put out a child's book. I guess I'll do it this time. And the book became an incredible bestseller over the next year and a half. And she became celebrated. And there she was in her mid-40s. She's an extraordinary person. And I think what I want to really stress here is, as we get into the X stuff and we look at a lot of the mystery school activity, we're looking at a lot of extraordinary people. And I think this is that the light from the efforts that they made in their lives can really help us to sort out a lot of these issues, frankly. So Annie Besant, Blavatsky, Casey, Emma Hardinge, Britton, just incredible people breaking through and using their incredible abilities. And it's service oriented. Remember, there's a great quote in the Casey material about attunement and service. It's not just about attunement. Because if it was just about attunement, I'd get all these skills. I'd be this master yogi. And then but if it doesn't fulfill itself in service, if it isn't given out, then it becomes something that kind of explodes on itself. So the whole point, the whole crux of the thing is that, like Steiner said, these forces were working to evolve planet Earth in this White Lodge, that imagery that he was using. The idea is that you take on these incredible skills and then you use them for the good of humanity. That is, that doesn't always work out that way, but that's certainly the goal with it. Okay, one more question.
This is the question I say for last. Jumbo, what is the goal of Daniel's X research? What are we trying to uncover? An ultimate purpose?
Oh, interesting. It's great to see you out there. Well, yeah, I wasn't thinking about it in terms of purpose, actually. I was thinking about it in terms of discovering what the X represented from mystery school times and relating specifically to the UFO file, and how that was moved through these different government agencies, and how we could get an idea, if we follow that X, our whole version of history, our whole version of humanity, our whole spiritual ideal. There's a number of things that can come into focus, and it's a much larger picture, as any discovery would be. So it's discovery is the goal of what we're doing with the X, and but also to get it right, to not let our imaginations or blocks or research get in the way, to really follow it where it goes. And the wonderful thing about the X, because these people are operating on that higher level with the steganography, and I don't mean the mystery school people, I mean, some of them are involved, of course, but even people just working on moving that stuff, they're aware, they're using a system of identification, because an X is a very simple way to do it. And it's also the letter, the least amount of words start with X out of any other letter in the alphabet. So it's a solid idea. But we've gone into it, and it reminds me, it's kind of a fragment of a whole unknown world of things that they've been putting together. So getting a glimpse of this other reality that's running parallel with ours can be absolutely crucial. And it can become even life-saving, in a sense, that when you discover this information as a culture, it might be something which will really give us a chance. And with that, I will leave everyone. It's fantastic. Again, please go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter so we can stay in touch with each other beyond the social media systems or YouTube. And don't forget also to subscribe, because subscriptions are the heart of the Dark Journalist program. It's how we get supported, working directly with you. And it's a much better way for us to go than doing advertising or something horrible like that. But I find that I think for about $4 a month, we can continue to give you incredible output around these issues and bring you the best guests talking about them. I do feel, if you look at the alternative media, it's incredible need of an upgrade. And I feel like the work that we do and the guests that we present, I'm always in favor of mentioning these people, people like Alexandra Bruce from Forbidden Knowledge TV, Catherine Austin Fitz from Solari.com, Joseph Farrell, of course, from Giza Death Star, sites like Cryptagon. Just amazing. This is the amazing work. And of course, what we try to provide you at Dark Journalist. So I say go for the media that is enlivening your life, not destroying it, or fear porn or making you nervous. Just go for the stuff where we can learn some things together. And so I hope you will join us next week, part 9 of the X series, and it's going to be incredible. But it's been great having you. Thanks for joining us last night. Thanks for joining us tonight. And Olivia?
One last thing. So if people sign up for the newsletter, can they get a reading list from you divided into different topics, like esoteric topics?
Oh, yeah. Well, what's going to happen is when we get to part 10, which is part X of the X series, I'm going to put together a presentation and a list. And that list is going to go for subscribers because they're going to be interested in getting that kind of presentation. I will have materials available relating to each episode. It's kind of a retrospective on all those episodes. And then we're going to look at that point and see where the research takes us. But absolutely, that's going to be crucial. And of course, we're going to be working on something. I'm going to call it a presentation. I'm going to call it a documentary straight up. But of course, it's going to be a documentary. So that's something that we're going to have that's going to incorporate the things that we're finding. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to do the X episodes because all the information and all the research is related. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you. In many ways, it's an open source kind of venture because I do think on a certain level, we're all opening our eyes to the fact that this X Steganography has been right under our nose. We started with the UFO file and how they moved that, and we've gone deeper into the mystery schools and how they impacted this and got us ready for it, and also into the political spectrum. So certainly we're going right into the heart of the matter, and it's only going to get deeper from here. So thank you very much. Again, it's Dark Journalist, and it's been terrific being with you. And Olivia, outstanding job.
Thank you.
Thank you. And a shout out, let's see who I can give a shout out to here at the end. Heather Pauly, it's great to see you out there. Thank you very much. And Najat, good night. Thank you very much. Jay Mallet. Good to see these people out there. No Name, always excellent suggestions. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's just great. I always love coming over here and seeing some familiar faces and also the new ones. Lion of Judea, thank you very much. Terrific feedback from you. Appreciate it. And, you know, that reminds me, which is on Twitter. Of course, we're on Twitter and we post things up there. And that's at Dark Journalist. So feel free to give us a shout over there as well. And we will speak with you next week. Olivia, did you have something?
No.
Okay.
Good night, everybody.
Well, maybe you can tell us, you know, what's going to be good for dinner tonight.
No, it's going to be ice cream again.
Unbelievable. All right. What can you do? All right. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye. No, I like that idea.